Hi there, Michael here with another weekly Bible in 1 year reflection. So this week we've been in Exodus looking at God giving the law to Israel from Mount Sinai. And I don't know about you, but I found it a little bit hard going reading at times. There's a lot of detail in there. I can imagine if I was a Hebrew boy at Hebrew school going over the detail of kind of how the priest's robes were supposed to look and how the tabernacle was going to be laid out. It just would not have been my favourite subject. But there we go. In the midst of it all, something actually still stood out to me really strongly. And that was to do with Israel wrestling and struggling to come to terms with their new lifestyle and their new identity. So last week we read about the Exodus and the fact that life in Egypt was really tough for Israel. So when Moses first goes to the Israelite elders and suggests leaving, they're all really up for it. But the minute they get into the desert, they begin to feel the pinch. And I think it's easy, and we often zone in on the fact they moaned and grumbled. But the thing that stood out to me was the fact that their request was always, can we go back to Egypt? It was better for us there than here. Why did you even bring us here in the first place? Basically, the minute things become tough, instead of trusting in God and rallying around one another and encouraging one another, their instinct was to go back to what they knew, to go back to what was familiar, however unideal that was. So this grumbling happens on several occasions, and each time the request is, can we go back to the way things used to be? But when Moses does take God's offer of a covenantal relationship to the elders once they are in the desert, they do agree. They say, we'll do whatever the Lord commands. And it's like the intent was there. The desire to be Yahweh's people was in them. After, I guess, he had brought them through the sea, he had provided for their needs in the desert. But the pull in them to go back to what they knew just continued. So when Moses has been up the mountain for 40 days, they start to say, who was this fellow Moses? And they build the golden calf. And that in and of itself was going back to what they knew in creating an idol, a visible picture of their God. They were practicing the same kind of religion they were used to in Egypt. It was going back to something familiar. It was going back to what they knew before. And what I find interesting is their future and God's expectations of them and all of that. It was all clear. God had explained it all, sometimes in painstaking detail. They knew what they were moving towards. They knew they were heading to the promised land. And they knew that they had this law. They knew what it was supposed to look like. But it just required quite a lot of faith and quite a lot of hard work. Required hard work because they had to build stuff, they had to create stuff, they had to learn new habits, they had to find a new way of being. And it required more faith because they weren't yet in the promised land. They had to believe that one day all of the hard work would pay off and they would find themselves there. And they were up for it. That's what I love is, their hearts really did want to put in the work and they really did want to cling on to the faith. It was just that when the going got tough, the temptation, the tendency to go back to their old lifestyle, their old comforts, their old patterns of behaviour just got too strong. And I don't know about you, but I can totally empathise with that. I find it amazing that, yes, there's always new depths to God and new depths to the relationship that we can have with Him. But sometimes the invitation into that new depth pulls us into a place which is hard. Even though what He's asking of us is so much better for us. He's leading us to a promised land, not back to Egypt. And although what He's asking of us might be really clear, He may make it really obvious, it still demands faith and work. And I genuinely am up for it. I'm so up for the ride. I so want to say yes to God and everything that He has for me. But sometimes when life gets difficult, the temptation to slip back into old habits and old comfort zones and sources of security and just old paradigms, just because they're familiar and therefore they're easier. And I know they're not as good as what God wants for me, but I just find myself being attracted to that familiarity. So 3 things I've kind of learnt this week from reading. 1, the pull back to the kind of old ways. God's people have felt that ever since day 1. So I shouldn't be surprised if I do. Second thing is that God finds it frustrating. God actually got really annoyed with Israel. but had grace for them, thank goodness. And actually, thankfully, in Jesus, we have a kind of a new level to that grace, if you like, as well. So although God does find it frustrating when we slip back into old things, there is grace. And the third thing, and I guess this is the thing to cling on to, is um, however much of a challenge it is, and however strong the temptation gets, however tough life may feel like it is, where God is trying to lead us is always better than where we've been before. He's always in the process of taking us from an Egypt to a promised land. He's always leading us out of something which wasn't as good for us as what he has for us. And we just need to rally together, grit our teeth, encourage one another, and keep going. So they're my reflections on this week's reading. We'd love to hear what your reflections are. Maybe make a comment below or send us an email to the office. Next week we get into Leviticus, so this is a good time to practice rallying together, encouraging one another and persevering. But do keep going, do keep reading, do keep sharing what you're learning with us, and let's keep discovering God as we read the Bible in 1 year. There is a